Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the Harkin-Engel Protocol. I'm glad to be here with our distinguished panelists and my friend, Senator Tom Harkin. Tom, it's always so good to see you, and it's hard to believe that nearly 2 decades have gone by since you and I started working on this issue. One of my most memorable experiences in Congress was traveling with Tom to West Africa and seeing firsthand the challenges in eliminating child labor from the cocoa supply chain. Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana are the world's largest producers of cocoa. 60% of annual global cocoa production comes from just these two countries. Naturally, the cocoa industry is a major employer and important to the economies and development of both countries, but the problem of child labor has posed an enduring challenge. After learning the truth about how cocoa is sourced, in 2001, I introduced an amendment that passed the House to fund a no child slavery label for chocolate products sold in the United States. This amendment helped to raise awareness of child labor in the cocoa sector. Shortly thereafter, I teamed up with Senator Harkin to work on this issue. He was able to advance our efforts from his powerful perch as both chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee and the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education. Now, we didn't end up getting everything we wanted, but we were able to reach an agreement with the cocoa and chocolate industries aimed at eradicating the worst forms of child labor throughout the chain of chocolate production. That agreement became known as the Harkin-Engel Protocol. The protocol established a commitment among the cocoa industry, the governments of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and the U.S. Department of Labor to reduce child labor by 70% across the cocoa sectors in these two countries, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. The protocol has encouraged stakeholders to end their reliance on child labor and get at the root causes that keep children in this harmful work: the shifting market, labor migration patterns, inadequate regulation and law enforcement, and of course, poverty. We've made significant progress, but we still have a long way to go before we see an end to this abuse. In the cocoa sector alone, millions of children continue to toil in child labor. What will be the keys to future success? The importance of partnerships with multilateral organizations, governments, the private sector, and civil society. We all have a shared responsibility to eradicate the worst forms of child labor from supply chains, both for children in need of advocates and consumers looking to make ethical purchases. We must ensure continued coordination among all partners and determine the best path forward to bring an end to child labor practices. As we reflect on the Harkin-Engel Protocol and look to the future of eliminating the worst forms of child labor, it is up to all of us to determine how to best support effective ongoing efforts, engage with experts and the cocoa industry, and consider new regulatory measures. Before we begin, I will turn it over to Senator Harkin, my friend. It's a pleasure working with him. We want to hear what he has to say, what his thoughts are on the protocol and our Congress. Senator Harkin.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm coming across now. I never know on these devices whether this is working or not, but I'll proceed as though it is. First of all, let me thank Chairman Engel for his many years of public service, first as a member of the New York State Assembly, and then 32 years as a United States Congressman from the state of New York. Let me also thank Congressman Engel for his commitment to ending the scourge of child labor around the globe, and for inviting me to be a part of this briefing this morning. I've had the pleasure of working with Congressman Engel on this protocol starting back, as he said, in the year 2000. It was our hope and goal to create a structure that would work to both eliminate the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa fields of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and to help the families and the children there to have access to safe working conditions and education. The Harkin-Engel Protocol is set to expire in 2021. And as the chairman has said, we've made a little progress, but it has not worked as well and as thoroughly as we had hoped. We had also hoped that this protocol could serve as a template for other types of protocols in other countries where children work in hazardous conditions and are denied their childhood and their education. I still feel that this protocol can be the template that brings together the private sector, government, and NGOs to form a pathway towards ending the worst forms of child labor around the globe. But I think it appears now that the protocols must have enforceable targets with economic or trade penalties, and any shortcomings should be rectified and attended to by the cocoa industry chain. The goals set forth by our agreement in 2010 of reducing the worst forms of child labor in both countries by 70% was not met, but we should not give up. A little progress has been made. We've shed a lot of light on the problem, but just not as much again as the signers of the protocol had set in 2010. Therefore, I hope this briefing will illuminate these shortcomings and what needs to be done in the future. Let me thank our panelists. First, the ILO, under the great leadership of Guy Ryder, a friend for many, many years, and the office here in the United States headed by Kevin Cassidy for their long and persistent work to end abusive child labor around the globe. ILO has just been wonderful. And ILAB at the Department of Labor, the team there led by Kevin Willcutts, I want to thank them for their continuing work and also for their annual reports on child labor. And of course, UNICEF in Côte d'Ivoire thank them for being our eyes and ears on the ground and in the cocoa fields as to what is happening. So looking ahead, I am hopeful that the next administration and the next Congress will give attention to this protocol and the scourge of abusive child labor in the cocoa fields of these two countries, and to use whatever leverage it can to meet the goals set forth in the 2010 Declaration and Framework of Action as rapidly as possible. Having spoken with Congressman Engel, I think I can say that we both commit ourselves to continuing to work with the next Congress and the next administration to make this happen. Chairman Engel, thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this briefing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Senator. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And I feel so much younger because you and I got together so many times 10 years ago. So it's just great seeing you again. You haven't changed. Haven't changed in looks and haven't changed in commitment. And I'm really, it's really been a pleasure for me to work with you. I would now like to introduce our speakers and look forward to hearing their insights. Each of today's experts is able to speak about child labor in the cocoa sector from a unique perspective, as their organizations have been heavily invested in the Harkin-Engel Protocol. Kevin Cassidy is the director and representative to the Bretton Woods and Multilateral organizations at the International Labor Organization Office for the United States. Kevin Willcutts is the Deputy Director at the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking in the Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs. Emanuele Biraghi is the Partnership Specialist at UNICEF Côte d'Ivoire. I'll now turn it over to our moderator, Camilla, to recognize each panelist for a brief presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Engel. We will now turn to Mr. Cassidy for his presentation. Mr. Cassidy, if we can have your video on for your presentation, please.
You hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Engel, Senator Harkin, members of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, on behalf of the International Labor Organization, I wish to thank you for your invitation to provide input for this briefing on the impact of the Harkin-Engel Protocol on eliminating the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa sector. When the International Labor Organization looks critically at the overall impact of global efforts on eliminating child labor, we cannot unequivocally state that the Harkin-Engel Protocol has made a significant and enduring contribution to the elimination of child labor in cocoa-growing areas in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. In brief, The protocol has helped shape a vision of shared responsibility that brought key stakeholders to the table, provided a powerful voice in developing coordinated collective responses underpinned by universal principles and the rule of law, helped hundreds of thousands of small-scale cocoa farmers in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire through technical assistance, productivity enhancements, and improved access to training and education as an alternative to child labor, and has served as a model for action in other sectors. The ILO's global work in eliminating child labor, especially its worst forms, has not only benefited from the innovations and galvanizing effect of the protocol, it has also benefited from the personal commitment and strategic long-term vision of both Representative Engel and Senator Harkin in championing this issue. The long and collaborative history and partnership between the protocol and the ILO begins with our Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor, Convention 182, which I am pleased to announce has reached universal ratification this year. I will outline how the protocol has directly contributed to the global action that has resulted in the reduction of nearly 100 million child laborers in the world today. In our efforts to implement Convention 182, new approaches were urgently needed to tackle the worst forms of child labor, and this included action on preventative measures, monitoring and remediation, and partnership creation for better coordination. The protocol predicted the need for long-term funding, which was provided through the Department of Labor's Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking, which has supported the work of the ILO, and the US has provided critical funding on data gathering based on the definition of child labor as set out in ILO conventions and international bodies of labor statisticians. The improvement and international collaboration on data collection and analysis has enhanced our understanding of the nature, consequences, and scope of child labor in the cocoa sector more than any other supply chain. We strongly believe that building such strong evidence-based has been critical in developing effective policies. With support of the US Department of Labor, the ILO has developed groundbreaking approaches to cocoa growing areas in West Africa, including what is known as the integrated area-based approach, child labor monitoring systems, and the development of national action plans against child labor. The ILO has focused its work in cocoa on strengthening the capacity of public institutions to implement ILO conventions on child labor, including labor inspectorates and the educational system. The ILO has found that labor inspectorates often do not have sufficient capacity or funds to address child labor in rural communities, and this is a key gap that must be addressed. The ILO continues to assist in the development of strong legislative framework in translating ILO conventions into national law, which was a primary step that we undertook in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. In both countries, hazardous work lists have been adopted, providing clarity on the activities that are prohibited for all persons under 18 years of age, and by the same token, what work is allowed for children who have reached that minimum age. Supporting cocoa-growing communities to organize child labor committees, access opportunities for income-generating alternatives, and reducing barriers to formal and non-formal education have increased resilience of cocoa-growing communities. The protocol's focus on public-private partnerships has helped the ILO work more closely with the chocolate industry and improve productivity, as well as enhance community-based child labor monitoring systems linked to national child protection systems. The use of an area-based approach to prevent the remediate all forms of child labor in cocoa-growing communities has been extremely effective in ensuring that child labor is not simply displaced from one supply chain to another or into another form of child labor. At the global level, partnerships have also been vital, including the formation of the Child Labor Cocoa Coordinating Group, which is an innovative public-private partnership with the aim of rooting out abusive labor practices in the cocoa supply chain. Through the ILO's unique tripartite system and its role as a technical agency of the United Nations, the ILO has provided a link between the protocol and the multilateral system, which has further connected efforts in the cocoa sector to the worldwide movement against child labor. With the innovative qualities of the protocol and the ILO's link to the UN system, it has been able to place child labor at the center of international development agenda with the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In our efforts to give agency to the internationally recognized target, the ILO has developed a multi-stakeholder partnership called Alliance 8.7, which refers to the SDG target 8.7 that names the elimination of the worst forms of child labor as a specific goal. The partnership was launched to accelerate action, conduct research, and share knowledge through innovation and leveraging of resources. One of the main areas of focus of the Alliance is child labor in supply chains. Businesses can participate in Alliance 8.7 through the Child Labor Platform, which is the only cross-sectorial, business-led initiative to eliminate child labor in supply chains. Member companies from the apparel, automotive, cosmetics, coca, cotton, beverage, telecommunications, trading, and mining sectors benefit from opportunities to exchange information about effective practices to tackle child labor in global supply chains and tap into the ILO's global expertise. With the rise of COVID-19 pandemic, we face new challenges that threaten to reverse decades of progress in eliminating child labor. Tens of millions of children may fall into extreme poverty as a result of unprecedented job and income losses, and the cutoff of remittances and sudden catastrophic health costs can create that tipping point. In face of such circumstances, families can be forced to rely upon their children as a survival strategy. School closures have disrupted education around the world, and from past experiences, the longer children are out of school, the less likely they are to return. Girls in particular are burdened with more domestic and care work and are particularly vulnerable. To avert the worst impacts of COVID-19 on child labor, including in Coca, enacting comprehensive social protection measures, creating decent work for adults and youth of legal working age, and ensuring inclusive, qualitative education for all will make a critical difference. Businesses must do their part by conducting effective human rights due diligence, using a whole of supply chain approach. They need to ensure that their management systems and purchasing practices support their responsibility to respect human rights and are aligned with nationally determined policies and programs. The ILO has also worked closely with the UN to designate 2021 as the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor, for which we will launch new child labor estimates. We are also pleased to announce that in 2022, South Africa will host the 5th Global Conference on Child Labor. Another important area for action is the incorporation of fundamental labor rights, including the elimination of child labor, in trade agreements. For example, the USMCA trade agreement mentions the ILO by name and lists the 4 fundamental rights which we believe are important in making lasting changes. ILO's experience has shown that social auditing alone is insufficient in dealing with global supply chains that are comprised of hundreds of thousands of small farms. New approaches based on strong public-private partnerships that take long-term preventative approach focused on root causes, as well as the promotion of decent work for older siblings and parents, is essential to continued success. In closing, I must state the obvious. The complexity of child labor means that there is no single or simple answer. We know that child labor is the product of an array of economic and social forces, and attempting to address it without consideration of these forces is unlikely to be successful. Child labor needs to be mainstreamed into broader social policies rather than treating it as an isolated issue. Strategic responses need to be tailored to a variety of contexts in which child labor persists, such as state fragility and armed conflict, where a large share of children in child labor do live. Here I will close where I started. The Harkin-Engel protocol has made a significant and enduring contribution to the elimination of child labor in coca-growing areas in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. The ILO stands ready to help the next generation of leaders and legislation they bring forth to accelerate action for a world without child labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Willcutts, if you would like to begin your presentation and turn on your video.
Thank you, Chairman Engel and Senator Harkin, for inviting us to participate in this briefing and for your leadership on this issue. The U.S. Department of Labor has been an active supporter of efforts to combat child labor in the cocoa sector under the Harkin-Engel Protocol since 2001. In 2002, DOL and USAID jointly funded a study on child labor in the West African cocoa sector carried out by the International Institute of Tropical. That year, US DOL also funded the Regional West Africa Cocoa Action Project, implemented by the International Labor Organization. This project, which ran until 2006, withdrew or prevented over 8,500 children from child labor in cocoa growing areas of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana through the provision of educational services. It provided more than 850 parents with livelihood services. The project also supported the piloting of community-based child labor monitoring system, addressing a critical need, given the number of smallholder cocoa farms and their often remote location. In 2006, DOL awarded a contract to Tulane University to conduct research on the prevalence and nature of child labor in the cocoa sectors of Côte d'Ivoire. Tulane also assessed progress in reducing the worst forms of child labor in the sector. Findings of the Tulane survey demonstrated the scope and nature of the problem. In turn, it demonstrated the need for more coordinated action to address the worst forms of child labor. Building on the commitment made in the protocol, in 2010, the U.S. Department of Labor came together with the governments of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana and the international chocolate and cocoa industry to sign the Declaration of Joint Action to support implementation of the Harkin-Engel Protocol. This declaration committed the signatories to work together. To reach this goal, the framework called for new and expanded initiatives in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, including provision of education and vocational training services for vulnerable children to help remove or prevent them from entering the worst forms of child labor. Protecting children from hazardous work associated with cocoa farming, making farming safer for children of legal working age. Promoting livelihood services for households of children to help reduce reliance on child labor. Establishing and implementing community-based child labor monitoring systems, and conducting nationally representative child labor surveys at least every 5 years so we could assess the progress being made. At the signing of the declaration, the U.S. Department of Labor committed $10 million to accelerate work to achieve these goals. Since that time, the U.S. Department of Labor has allocated more than $30 million for projects aimed at preventing and reducing child labor in cocoa-growing areas of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Collectively, these projects have provided education and training services to more than 26,000 children engaged in or at risk of child labor. Livelihood services to approximately 8,200 households. They've helped raise awareness of child labor. They supported efforts by the governments of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana to adopt or refine laws, policies, and national action plans on child labor, and to develop government-run child labor monitoring systems. They've empowered 90 communities to address child labor locally through the development and implementation of community-based action plans. They've assisted companies in developing codes of conduct, provided training to government officials, company representatives, trade unionists, and other civil society stakeholders on identifying forced labor. Since 2010, the Department of Labor has also funded 2 nationally representative surveys of child labor in the cocoa-growing areas of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. The first, by Tulane, covered the 2013-2014 harvest season. The second, implemented by NORC at the University of Chicago, covered the 2018-19 harvest season and is due to be released next week on October 19th. The U.S. Department of Labor has also played an active role as a member of the Child Labor Cocoa Coordinating Group. U.S. DOL remains committed to the goal of eradicating child labor from cocoa production in Ghana. To that end, this year we announced our intention to fund 2 new projects in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, with a focus on increasing the number of cocoa cooperatives taking action to help reduce child labor in cocoa supply chains. Moreover, our annual research and reporting on child labor through our flagship report, Findings on the Worst Forms of Child Labor, and our country-specific lists of goods made with child labor or forced labor, TVPRA list, have shed a light on the problem while highlighting and assessing government actions to address it. Harkin-Engel Protocol and the subsequent 2010 declaration to support its implementation have demonstrated the importance of multi-stakeholder engagement in bringing all parties to the table. Under the Harkin-Engel Protocol, we have seen an increase in awareness and acknowledgement of the problem of child labor. increase in the collection of quality data on the scope and nature of child labor in the sector, expansion of interventions to promote children's access to quality schooling, reduce reliance of households on child labor, piloting of community-based child labor monitoring systems, support for community action plans to give communities a voice and access to resources to reduce child labor. We have seen leadership from the government of Côte d'Ivoire, notably under the direction of First Lady Dominique Ouattara, and from the government of Ghana, leading to national action plans and significant progress in areas such as access to schooling. From industry, we've seen new commitments of resources for vulnerable children, new commitments for sourcing certified cocoa, and a willingness to come to the table as partners in this effort. We have seen international organizations like the ILO and UNICEF lending their knowledge and expertise, along with organizations such as the International Cocoa Initiative and the World Cocoa Foundation. We've also seen active engagement by non-governmental and civil society organizations, including the Child Labor Coalition and the Voice. Our challenge today is to take what we've learned from 20 years of efforts under the Harkin-Engel protocol and scale up what works, while emphasizing the importance of evidence-based action. Child labor remains a significant problem. In this time of COVID, we know the risks to vulnerable children and families are greater than ever. Schools are impacted, labor monitoring is more challenging, human and financial resources are further stretched. In this environment, we need to continue to promote multi-stakeholder cooperation and the kind of public-private partnerships that have been a hallmark of the Harkin-Engel protocol. In short, we will all need to continue to play our part if we are to achieve our collective goal of ending child labor. I want to thank you again for inviting me to be here today and for your decades of leadership on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Willcutts. We will now turn to Mr. Biraghi for his presentation.
Chairman Engel, thank you for organizing this briefing. Thank you for yours and Senator Harkin's outstanding leadership on this important issue. And also thanks for the opportunity you're giving UNICEF to inform your reflection, as suggested by the Senator Harkin, with some local perspective from Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which I'm representing today. I'm currently calling from Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, where for the last 4 years, I've been following closely the dynamics of child labor in cocoa. And if there is one thing that I learned is that this is an incredibly complex issue that could and actually should be discussed for hours. And now, considering I only have 10 minutes, I'll do my best to condensate a few reflections on the most important topics. But I would like to reassure you that both from my side and from the side of my colleagues in Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Washington, we would be very keen to remain at your disposal to keep informing your work. With my intervention, I'd like to focus on 3 points: the positive impacts that the protocol allowed to achieve, the key trends that we're observing on child labor in cocoa, and some of the challenges that the protocol faced and some lessons learned. Maybe just a few words on UNICEF to help contextualizing my intervention. UNICEF is the custodian of the Convention of the Child, on the Convention of the Rights of the Child. We are also custodian and co-custodian of 19 child-specific indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. In Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, UNICEF is a key development partner of government supporting national assistance strengthening in favor of all children's rights. Concretely, this means supporting government effort to fight child labor, as well as other child protection issues like violence, abuse, but also support the development of other vital systems that are necessary to ensure children's access to education, health, nutrition, water, and social protection measures. This with yearly investment in both countries in the range of $50 million. UNICEF has also a team of experts, and this might be less known of a field, working on child rights and business. And in 2018, we conducted a study on the condition of children's rights in cocoa-growing communities in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. I'll be very happy to share it with you after this briefing. Finally, while not a signatory of the Harkin-Engel protocol, UNICEF has always been working closely with government to contribute and provide technical guidance to the discussion of the CSCCG. So even though my colleague panelists already elaborated a lot on the positive impact of the protocol, let me also add a few points which I think are important noticing. It is, first of all, quite a unique protocol and unprecedented tool that contributed significantly to change the dynamic of the fighting child labor in the sector. It galvanized stakeholders in two countries on a crucial child protection issue, followed by high-level political commitment and ambition. And for this, let me reiterate once again UNICEF gratitude, both to Chairman Engel and Senator Harkin leadership for throughout a very long quest and definitely not an easy one. Secondly, the protocol allowed to bring together different stakeholders that were coming from very different positions, importing government, producing government, industry, civil society, development actors, and most importantly, allowed to establish a more constructive dialogue and start building a good trust, even though some more work needs to be done. Third, it did contribute to develop important knowledge through data generation, but also through best practices on how to fight child labor. And it offers some quite important opportunities to learn how we could go further in the years to come. Maybe a few considerations on the trends we are observing nowadays. It's true that some progresses have been made in the fight to child labor in cocoa, particularly for what concerns the number of children that are exclusively working and those that are accessing formal education. And also, on this regard, an important contribution came from government efforts like mandatory education policies in Côte d'Ivoire in 2016, for instance. At the same time, it's undeniable that child labor prevalence is persistent, including its worst forms. Worst forms where the hazardous labor is probably the most common one, and the tasks most common are carrying of heavy loads, the utilization of sharp tools, and exposure to chemicals and pesticides. Unfortunately, with this last one, even being growing versus the past. And this might also be linked to some of the productivity investments which have been done that are clearly bringing some unintended consequences, which are important to consider because these are particularly critically impacts on children's health, and they can be visible only in the long term. So it's really important to bring attention on this aspect. One last important point to consider is that the vast majority of children in labor are actually living and working with their families. Families that are often living in poverty, often are illiterate, often without an identity, and spread over a wide geographical area with very limited access to basic social services. There are adverse social norms, as well as structural challenges to higher labor, particularly vis-à-vis economic shocks due to illnesses or other reasons, making child labor often the easiest alternative to activate for farmers. So these aspects are pushing us to slightly rethink the theory of change to fight child labor in cocoa. And while concepts like monitoring or law enforcement are valid principles, I think that in 2020, everybody agrees that only looking at these two aspects is not enough. And a much bigger emphasis needs to be put, as the colleagues correctly said, on prevention and focusing on child labor root causes. And this is particularly important in the context of a small-scale agriculture supply chain in a development country like cocoa is, where we are trying to deal with millions of independent and vulnerable smallholder farmers, which are spread over a wide geographic area. As you see, very different situation compared to big plantations or big factories where through one monitoring point you can hit thousands of workers. And this point leads me to a second lessons learned regarding the fact that while companies need to take full responsibility for their supply chain, it is important that their sustainability efforts and investment concur to support the national development efforts and to strengthen the national system. And even more, that they don't risk to replace them. So this consideration also has some quite direct implication for the policymakers, And we are observing some dynamics also on the side of the European Union, where with growing interest, people are looking at mandatory human rights due diligence or regulations, which are encouraged and which can be extremely powerful measures. The key is making sure that these measures create enabling conditions for businesses to invest, to work in synergies with the national development plans. There was a point made also by my predecessors, and I really believe it's a crucial one. Therefore, it's important to avoid that companies pushed to demonstrate some sort of compliance might end up putting more emphasis on efforts like audits or other similar interventions, which might not be the most strategic one in the fight to child labor. And last, but definitely not the least, probably one of the biggest challenges that the protocol faced has been, if you want, concerns the importance of ensuring that ambitious targets are equally accompanied by adequate resources which are required to achieve them. And the way to ensure this is, first of all, through solid bottom-up needs assessment on what needs to be true in order to address the key child labor root causes on the ground. And in this sense, I think that, as you told me, to be your eyes and on the ground, what I've been observing is a promising dynamic both in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, where both government, industry, development actor, and civil society are really working to set the foundation for a renewed public and private partnership that tries to bring to life some of the principles that I just mentioned, increase the emphasis on prevention, strengthening national systems, ensuring convergence and scale of interventions, and share investments and share responsibility. I would like, therefore, to take this occasion to thank once again you all and the efforts that the US government has made so far. Invite the US government to keep playing a strategic role in the fight to child labor, increasing the dialogue with all actors, including other important institutions like the European Union, who are confronted with similar challenges, and inviting you to join the dialogue and the dynamics that are already happening in both countries on the ground, and bring once again your important contribution to the cause. Because I think that if there is one other thing that I learned in these last 4 years is, unless all actors are really holding hands, I don't see how we can systematically and sustainably address child labor. Thanks for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer to questions in the limit of my capacity. Thanks again.
Thank you very much to our briefers for speaking to us. Chairman Engel will now begin his questions.
Thank you, and thank you to the people who briefed us. As required by the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, the ILAB maintains a list of goods and their source countries which were reasonably believed to have been produced by child labor or forced labor. But my question is, how has the list improved international outreach and engagement, and what other U.S. initiatives have proven to be useful in countering child labor?
Thank you, Chairman Engel. This is a great question. We have found in ILAP, the U.S. Department of Labor, that our research and reporting has been a critical part of the work that we've done to bring awareness to child labor around the world. Looking at the TVPRA lists of goods made with child labor or forced labor, that list has been extremely important in terms of showing where there are problems that need greater attention. And the inclusion of goods on that list has been a way to put a spotlight, but also to bring the parties to the table to say that there's an urgent need at this point, and to encourage actors to see what part they need to play to address it. You were asking about what sorts of tools we found to be effective globally in addressing child labor. We found that there needs to be a combination of collecting data and encouraging governments to collect and use that data. There's a need for public and private partners to look at interventions that can address the root causes, as my colleagues were just speaking to. And there's a need to see how we can have partnerships for monitoring supply chains. We need to understand where the problem is occurring, and we need to bring all actors to bear to do their part so that we can have an effective response. In a sector like cocoa, as my colleague from UNICEF was saying, it's particularly challenged because, as he said, it's not plantation type agriculture. So we need different approaches for each sector, but we need to have the kind of concerted action that has taken place under the Harkin-Engel protocol in order to make real progress. Child labor cannot be solved in a day, but we have to be working together every day in order to prevent the problem and also to reduce and hopefully eventually eliminate it. So thank you, Chairman Engel.
Thank you very much. I have one more question. There are several examples of successful initiatives meant to reduce child labor in both Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, which includes partnering with cooperatives and creating community monitoring systems. But how can these efforts be scaled?
Maybe is the question directed to a specific panelist or everyone?
Anybody who
Okay.
likes to, yeah.
Okay, maybe I can start sharing few ideas, and the others can complement. I think an important thing to realize is also the configuration of the cocoa sector supply chain. It's true that leveraging cooperatives, it's a promising direction, but it's also true that today only roughly 40% of farmers are organized in cooperatives. So, and the hard to reach ones, the more unorganized and more spread out in different places, may actually be the most vulnerable ones. So there needs to be, on one side, a progressively effort also nationally led to progressively structure more and more farmers in cooperatives to create some forms of resilience. But also some other approaches need to be thought to consider also that long tail of farmers that are less easy to be reached through cooperatives and probably more expensive to be reached. That's why, in that sense, strengthening national social systems like social workers and others may actually be an interesting strategy. Over.
If I may, just to add to that very quickly is to say that overall, the unique nature for the ILO in the sense of our tripartite structure and bringing to bear the expertise of the unions on the ground certainly can help the farmers in organizing themselves better. Also, as was mentioned a bit earlier about research, certainly more research is necessary to look at those domestic supply chains, because in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, they are very complex domestic supply chains, which are not always, shall we say, given the attention they should be, due to a number of factors such as the lack of the labor inspectorates to go to the rural areas. I think what has happened through the protocol, by having that longer term vision, by understanding that you need a sustained effort on that is absolutely essential. And then also back to the modalities of that you mentioned a bit earlier, the ILO, through its supervisory mechanism, there through our independent committee on the application of standards, it provides a framework and a reference point that our independent experts can actually speak to the various governments and the workers and employers organizations on the ground to be able to show what action looks like that is taken that is, shall we say, a little bit more progressive. So by having this pincer movement of having the international organizations, national governments work on the ground with the farmers and with our trade unionists, I believe that creates the conditions to be able to move this agenda item further forward. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the difficulties we had at some point during the protocols, 20 years, 25 years, was that originally the industry was not very helpful. But after they saw what we were doing and we offered to have them join us, they were helpful. Does anyone have a feeling about what the industry is doing nowadays? There's always more that we can do, but has there been an attempt to block what was done, or has there been an attempt to enhance it? I know it's a tough one, but I wonder if anybody has any insight on that.
Right. If I may, and apologies for taking the floor again, I was speaking actually to our colleagues in the U.S. Council for International Business, which is our business operations. The following thoughts came from them, that companies and the government of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, civil society organizations, have seen this as a collective action. And I think over the last few years have started to scale up their efforts for greater impact. Companies are starting to work more readily with governments to transform this, today's generation of children, to protect them from the hazardous labor on cocoa farms through awareness raising and obviously access to education. This does require more ambitious partnerships and collaboration, which can build on the learning through the last 2 decades. But it is true that companies alone cannot solve these problems. We as the ILO are committed, as well as our business associates, in launching new public-private partnerships to help bring to the table UN agencies, farmer groups, civil society organizations, to really tackle the root causes of child labor. As I mentioned earlier, child labor sometimes is not only the consequence of poverty, but the lack of opportunities for people. And also, I think we have seen over the last few years that companies are really ramping up their investments to fight child labor. I think this might be also in response to the kind of mandatory elements that come about in terms of the forced labor issue, which are not existent here now, where it's a voluntary approach. I'll kind of stop at that water's edge right there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And if I may complement,
Certainly.
I think that a couple of interesting trends might be worth be noticed. So I think that surely companies are doing more today than what they've been doing in the past. The question remains, is more enough? This is something that can be discussed. I think there is, though, I think it's important, though, to make a distinction and not treat the sector and the companies that are doing something as the same thing. Because in all fairness, it's also true that some companies are doing something, but some others are having a sort of free ride nowadays. So the challenge is that obviously big brands are always most exposed to public criticisms and naming and shaming, and so obviously they need to take more responsibility. But there are other parts of the overall cocoa sector that are more vulnerable and less exposed to such dynamics. Therefore, what I'm observing is somehow a sort of a prisoner dilemma situation where somebody might even be potentially keen to do more, and particularly to do more in a sense of investing more in prevention, system strengthening, and so on. But what is missing is to do that kind of the confidence to do that leap of faith to make sure that the whole sector will do it. So in this sense, measures like human rights due diligence, or even measures that really try to set up platforms to invest on national systems, can be game-changing dynamics that create a level playing field so that all companies feel comfortable to work together and increase their investment in a pre-competitive mindset. The issue is if somebody does it and the others are not, they are still facing each other in a competitive arena for what concerns the production and the selling of products. And therefore, simply speaking, being more mindful and responsible means having higher production costs. So profitability and marginability is eroded. So that's something that policymaking can help in terms of creating common ground for everybody in terms of basic conditions that companies should comply to. Over.
Thank you. I'm going to turn back my questions, but I just want to make one comment. Of all the years I've been in Congress and all the trips I've taken, the one I remember the most was our trip to Ghana. We went into a really rural area, and the children, there were lots of children there, and they were laughing and running with us. And I had a camera that was new in those days, where you took pictures, and then you looked at the camera and you saw the pictures that you took, and that we were doing that with the kids, and they were laughing and screaming. They had never imagined anything that could do that. They had never seen anything like that before. And what it really made me understand even more is that if people are given the opportunity, they will excel. If kids are forced to be in the family farms year in and year out and don't ever have a chance, that's where they're going to wind up for their whole life. And so, what we're doing, I think, is really important work. And I want to thank you and everyone else who has come here today to let us know what you're doing. We still have a lot of work to do, but I think that doing it together, we will continue to make progress. So thank you. I turn this back to the moderator.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, for your questions. Before I recognize Senator Harkin for any questions he may have, I just want to make a note that one of our panelists, Mr. Willcutts, has a hard stop at noon. We'd like to thank him in advance for his participation and for any last answers that he fits in before he has to go. Senator Harkin, you can take it away with your questions, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I thank all the panelists for their great statements and for the work that they continue to do in this area. I guess a couple of things. I want to echo a little bit what Chairman Engel said about our trip that we took there. One of the things that impressed me most was the community involvement. In all these rural areas, everyone is part of some small community. And they were doing awareness raising through small plays and productions of showing that children under the age of 14 should not be in the fields, they should be in school, and that kids over the age of 14 could only work in the fields after school or on a weekend, but they had to go to school first. I thought that was very impressive in terms of getting people to change their concept on a community level. I'm just wondering if that has continued on in both Ghana and the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, on a community level. Secondly, there's a company called Tony's Chocolonely. They sold 43 million bars of chocolate last year, and they certify that all of their chocolate is farmed and produced without child labor. So if they can do that, why can't Mars and Hershey and Nestle's and Godiva and everybody else, why can't they also do that kind of certification that Tony's Chocolonely is doing? That's my question. Why can't other companies do that kind of certification? Again, I would throw that open to anybody,
Okay. So thanks, Senator Harkin. Maybe I can start and my colleagues can complement. First, on community level, absolutely, it's key. I think you hit a very important point. The dynamics that are happening in the community are vital to create that resilience and that change of social norms, which is critical to eradicate child labor. This goes into the direction of setting up more and more community-based child protection committees, but also using the community as a center to promote certain other areas that contribute to overall strengthen the resilience of communities, from village and savings loans, village savings and loans associations. Sorry, I'm back translating from French. To community awareness raising and training on aspects like nutrition, health, access to water. These are all factors that affect significantly the vulnerability of farmers, and therefore the likelihood that they may activate children as a form of labor. And so in that sense, I would say, I would like to reassure you that all actors that I'm seeing are going into that direction. For what concerns the question on Tony Chocolonely, maybe the perspective I might be sharing is more with my previous life when I was working for businesses in marketing. I would say Tony Chocolonely has a very distinctive value proposition from a marketing standpoint, and this is a very specific brand. So at the same time, it entered the niche. I don't know if all the others can enter the same niche in terms of premiumness that they can charge for a specific products. And simply speaking, they might have different business models to live with the way they set up their businesses. And beyond that, I think that there is a part that we need to remember. There are not only brands. Big brands are there and they account for a good amount of the volume, but there is all that world of semi-processed foods like cocoa powder, cocoa butter, and things that goes pretty much in a plethora of different sectors. And there is, in my view, is the most critical area, because often those companies are not equipped to have a sustainability department, strong investments on monitoring and so on. So this is a tough area, but some solutions needs to be found in that sense, and probably through level playing field legislations over.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If I may add to that, if my colleague Kevin Willcutts is not there, I think in addition to that, we are also looking at how to better train the farmers, to provide them with entrepreneurial training, understanding a bit better, for example, what are the prices of that commodity itself, even adding value instead of just exporting the raw commodity itself would certainly increase their opportunities, and also investment in their production processes. So I think that is certainly one element of it. I mentioned about the protections that could be provided through the galvanizing of the workers themselves. So that will also put upward pressure on greater investment in the production process, which I think is quite important. But also the training and upskilling of children, providing them, I think your example, Chairman Engel, about the children you've seen there, and my 38 years experience of going out to the field, there's no difference for me for a child whether they're in Ghana or in China or in Des Moines, Iowa. I think all children have this natural enthusiasm to learn things. They're very curious. So provided with the right opportunity, provided with education, provided with, for example, training in the digital economy, I think it then provides opportunities so that they can grow. But I do think also that businesses need to do better themselves, and to ensure that there are not so many layers in that, as I mentioned, domestic supply chain, with everyone taking their slice off of the pie. So I think we need to do a better analysis, and I think that the work that we are doing with the funding coming through the Department of Labor and looking at the issues and the research that's being done in statistics, that's helping us to make better policy decisions and to structure our interventions much more effectively. Over.
I wanted to just quickly add to that. You know, the industry initially, when Tom and I talked about doing this, was very hostile. They came around, and in fact, more than came around. They were good partners with us for a long for the years that we had these protocols. But I think that when the question was asked before about, well, why aren't things done? You know, I think the industry and others involved want to do the minimal amount that they can get away with because, you know, it's a pain in the neck to them. And we really have to call it out. There's no reason why these things shouldn't be followed up. They're doable. We talked a lot, Tom and I, when we were in Ghana, about going to school and then having the kids work in the farms afterwards, because people told us, you don't know what you're talking about. These are family farms. You're going to destroy family farms. And we didn't agree. We thought there were things that could do to help the family farms and also make sure that the children get educated. So, again, we were in rural Ghana. It wasn't the place that most tourists go to. And I saw a side of Ghana that I never saw before, or that I that I wouldn't have seen before because we weren't going on vacation. We were doing fact finding. But I just think the industry has got to make, more of a commitment. Tom's question about if one company can do it, why can't they all do it? Question is, they can all do it if there's the will there to do it. Tom Harkin and I have the will, but we need the industry to work with us, not to try to fight us on it. And I hope that they will continue to help us and do as much as we can.
Right.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Harkin, for your questions. We will now move to Representative Bass for her question.
Good morning, and thank you very much, or I should say good afternoon on the East Coast. Thank you very much, Chairman, for holding this briefing. And to Senator Harkin, I had the wonderful opportunity to travel to Africa with you several years ago. So congratulations to both of you for your work on this issue. I wanted to ask the panelists, whoever chooses to answer, I know everyone speaking today has been working on this issue for so many years, and I heard the first panelist talk about addressing the root causes, and I just wanted to know, from the perspective of the companies as well as the governments, our government as well as the French and other governments, and obviously the African governments, what have we done to develop the education systems in the countries? Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, I know when the president Akufu was inaugurated, one of his first goals was to make education universal. And obviously that's a great goal in the beginning of your presidency. He's running for re-election now. I'm not sure to the extent that he was able to accomplish that. But we know that one of the problems is it's nice to say the children should be in school, but what actual access to education do they have? And maybe you can respond to how that has been addressed as we have sought to eliminate child labor. That's for any of the panelists. The first panelist, and I'm sorry I don't have your name in front of me, would be great.
Representative Bass, thank you very much. Kevin Cassidy from the ILO. UNICEF normally deals with the educational component, but maybe just to speak a bit about what we see, as I mentioned in my presentation, about what we call social protection measures. And these are what we would refer to loosely as social safety nets. This is about nutritional assistance for young children. It is talking about the maternity, paternity leave to look after the children. It is looking at educational opportunities, pre-K throughout. So those protection measures, I mean, it's actually a national function, but in order to pay for that, you need the revenue. When you are stuck in exporting commodities, raw commodities, you're not adding value, you're not adding more money to the coffers themselves. It also is about the companies that are operational in the country themselves. Are they paying the appropriate amount of taxes? Are the taxes being collected? Are they being distributed in effective manners to these rural villages? For the ILO on the labor side, we know that the labor inspectorates are just not well funded. Unfortunately, labor in many countries is not the best funded departments that we see. So, yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the Global Partnership for Education?
Yes.
Because I know that is what they do and that they're seeking money. And I don't know if one of the strategies had ever been that, while we are addressing child labor, for where the children's supposed to go if they're not working.
Right. This is a not even multidimensional, but mega-dimensional approach in development, that it takes many actors to develop this. It's not just about money, but it's about making smart decisions. So when we first started looking at child labor, it was not just going in and plucking the children out of child labor, because then they would wind up maybe in worse forms of child labor.
Right.
So the idea is developing those alternatives and working with those groups that are expert at that. The ILO in the world of work can address the issues as a labor problem, but there are other institutions like UNICEF and other groups that we work with, and NGOs who are doing fantastic work. It is about going to scale. And going to scale requires not only funding, it requires coordination amongst your efforts, but also a long-term strategy and vision. So I think we are getting there. The Sustainable Development Goals show the interrelation between all of these elements within development, And I think we have to look at that. So the commitment to that multilateral approach to address this, I think, is absolutely essential. But you've put your finger on it. There are many people, many organizations that do excellent work. How do we bring that to scale? How do we integrate that into our operations on the ground as well?
Moving on, and I really, we have to get at this because I don't see how we address the problem if we don't. And then I think of two crises that have occurred over the last several years. One is Ebola and two is COVID. And I know that when Ebola hit, it really impacted the cocoa industry, even though neither country was severely impacted by Ebola, but I do remember it having a pretty devastating impact. And now we have COVID. And so I guess the question I want to ask, and to you or the other panelists, is how is the situation now? I mean, because I would have imagined that that would have made the child labor situation worse.
At the expense of maybe dominating the floor, my apologies. We are seeing with these complex pathogens, obviously tremendous impacts, especially on developing countries and poorer communities in those developing countries. Schools are closed. Children are out of school.
Right.
They may not go back to school, especially girls and young women who have even greater responsibilities for care, possibly of the elderly, or for household activities themselves. So I think the idea that complex pathogens, which are always there, and there is
Right.
no post-COVID-19, it will always be with us. How do we mitigate the worst examples of that? So now you've added and introduced another element, which is health. So we have the World Health Organization, we have UNICEF, we have UNESCO, we have the ILO. You have the international instruments, which quite honestly are a very good deal. They don't require tremendous amounts of funding relative to the impact that it has. But we do have to build these systems. These institutions have to be strong, not just in the major cities, although there is a drive towards urbanization, but in the rural areas as well. So it is through the partnerships, which the protocol has helped put to the forefront, and that the ILO and other UN agencies are now working on more collaboratively than we have in the past.
And you know what, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to go back to the Global Partnership for Education and reiterate and expand on what you were saying in terms of what you feel is needed, because it seems like these issues are being addressed from so many different quarters, but it isn't clear to me at all how it gets coordinated. You mentioned the sustainable development goals. Okay, that's good. But how does that directly connect? If the goal of the Global Partnership for Education is to promote universal education around the world, then what type of coordination is needed?
May I come in also with some perspective from the ground and from UNICEF, who's like in Côte d'Ivoire is actually the leading technical and financial partner of the Ministry of Education. I think that I go back to a point that I made before. We need to look at these challenges, not as cocoa sustainability challenges, but first and foremost as development challenges. It's true what my colleague said in terms of in the cocoa sustainability cast, we have been seeing a proliferation of little projects here and there, often driven also by the need of saying, I'm doing something. But what I perceived as the biggest opportunity, which has not yet been addressed, is really making convergence of these efforts. And that's why we need to understand that in countries like Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, but in pretty much every country, if there is a Ministry of Education, is probably the best place to set up, with the support of the development actors and financial institutions and so on, national development plans that, by the way, are in place, and which they can be and should be strengthened by private investment in this sense, under the narrative that they do contribute to child labor reduction. When it comes to education, also it's important to understand that there is the component of access to education, but there is also a component of quality of education and the learning outcomes that children are retaining, and this is very critical. There is the element related to, for instance, school canteens to make sure children are staying in school and they can learn more by having, simply speaking, their belly full. And that there are a number of things that make the education, as it has been said so far, a crucial intervention. And the Global Partnership for Education is, in fact, funding both Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and the national strengthening plans. Their contribution was important, particularly also in the distant learning that has been mentioned as one of the key challenges brought by the COVID. And I think that an additional challenge that we have not seen yet, but we will be most likely seeing in the near future, is the impact that COVID-19 had on chocolate consumption and therefore on chocolate processing. This is something that is always a sort of delay on these impacts. But in 2017, when we saw production going up and consumption not picking up as much, the price dropped terrifically. But terrifically, we're talking about a 40% price drop in farm gate price. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming future we might see a similar dynamic, so hitting with a second way of indirect consequences on farmers' poverty, because it's going to be difficult for a cocoa institution to sustain a certain level of price if the global market price will not grow at a certain level, basically.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Bass, for your questions. I will now move on to ask the questions that we have from the public. I have two of them. The first one is, over the previous 20 years, there have been several public-private partnerships created as a result of the Harkin-Engel protocol. From your perspective, what are some of the more successful interventions that could be modeled for future engagement? If we want to start with Mr. Biraghi and then go to Mr. Cassidy.
Thanks for the question for the public. It would be useful if the person who posed the question may make a specific reference to a specific partnership. Probably would be easier for us to comment on that one. What I'm seeing, like, in the meantime, I just can share a few generic principles that I'm observing in this dynamic that are happening on the ground. I think that like the trust building is a key component of any public-private partnership. And probably the challenging part is finding common ground to align interests of everybody. So those, interesting developments are now happening more and more, where companies are taking that famous leap of faith that I was mentioning before to go beyond their pure supply chain, understanding that by joining efforts with public actors, with development actors, they can actually gain more than by doing individual projects that they have full control of. So I think that there is this element on coordination, creating synergies, but also at the same time ensuring the highest possible level of transparency and accountability for this effort, because this trust building is a very delicate process as well, which can easily be eroded and collapse very fast if the different leaps of faith that have been made from different sides to work together feel they are betrayed to some extent. I'm just speaking about principles and dynamics, but if there are specific cases, I'm happy to comment on them if I can, even if I know them. Over.
Maybe just to contribute slightly to that conversation is to say that traditionally development funding from countries, not only just the United States, has usually been very time-bound. You've had 3 to 5 year years in order to address an issue. When you're trying to change or to improve situations on the ground, it takes more than just a few years. It takes generations to make that happen. In addition to that, we see that when a donor goes into a particular area, there seems sometimes to be the feeling that that's already covered, we'll move on to another issue. So we don't have the benefit of having several of the governments coordinating together and developing a more systemic or holistic response to those issues. That is starting to happen in areas such as refugee flows and looking after refugees and communities who are fleeing conflict, as well as the local communities. We have to also remember that we have the balance of many different elements there. What was mentioned a bit earlier, and this was also, I've been cautioned by my colleagues in the field, is that there is a proliferation of dozens of efforts that are taking place. And until the galvanizing effect or the sort of the magnet of the Sustainable Development Goals, many of those efforts were done in isolation. Now that we have a greater understanding of the development process, now that we have a central point of bringing that together, it is our hope that these individualized efforts will join together with other efforts of international organizations, local institutions, and other well-meaning civil society organizations will come together to make a specific effort to make that happen. And then finally, to say on legislation, there's a reason that efforts on forced labor and human trafficking have been very successful. They've been made mandatory. When you have voluntary efforts, sometimes that doesn't have the full impact of law. The ILO is a normative agency. We can only assist countries that actually ratify our conventions. And with that ratification, we can bring to bear the technical expertise of the organization. So I think that there are a number of issues there to address this. We are getting closer. It is, I could imagine, frustrating for many. And as a 36-year veteran of the UN system, we continue to believe that this is moving forward. And I do think in retrospect that we are getting to that place where we can be more effective. And thank to Senator Harkin and Chairman Engel, because that actually was an inflection point for the ILO in looking at bringing partnerships at different levels within society together. Over.
Thank you very much. I have one more question from the public, and this time we can start with you, Mr. Cassidy, to answer. Given our current climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity, are there any ongoing efforts to address both human rights and environmental concerns, particularly deforestation in the cocoa sector?
I don't know if I could address this at this time. I'm afraid I don't have as much information on that, but it is just to say that the ILO, being a normative agency, working in the world of work, that those who are workers and that are impacted about climate change or on natural disasters, those are the entry points for the ILO. We are working and developing collaboration through memorandums of understanding with the UN Environmental Program and other organizations. The ILO has actually just released a report with the World Wildlife Fund looking at how workers and the care of the planet can actually work together in harmony. So I would direct you to this new report, which is on the ILO's website today. Thank you.
Maybe to complement, I think the answer, simply speaking, yes. There is the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which has been an initiative launched a couple of years ago in response to public criticism from Mighty Earth, which was an NGO on the phenomenon of deforestation, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. That was under the supervision of the Prince Charles of Wales. So that has been, if you want, the first step towards acknowledging the challenge of deforestation and environmental issues in cocoa. There is nowadays a growing pressure from the European Union, particularly from states like France and others, about the concept of imported deforestation. And I think that the positive dynamic that I'm observing is that eventually, so the first level of consciousness expansion is there is an issue, there is a sustainability issue, let's deep dive on it. That's cool. And so there is deforestation, child labor, and if you want revenues and poverty for farmers. Level up in terms of expanding and creating synergies is actually all these three challenges are happening in the same countries, in the same sector, and different actors are working on them. So a dynamic that recently, that was less than a month ago, the European Union launched is this Sustainable Cocoa Dialogue, where under the leadership of 4 different directions, so DG Justice, Trade, Environment, and Development, they are trying to really make converge the different efforts, different sustainability efforts that are happening on the ground by setting up a dialogue platform at global level, but also in each country. So I think I'm also echoing the words of my colleague from ILO. I'm quite positive Because if there is a moment where we can reset a little bit the narrative and the practices and really do the right thing based on 20 years of experience, that moment is now. One thing, though, that may prevent us to go in that direction is the fact that, if you want, reluctancy of working together. Because sometimes, even though we are talking about a purely a pre-competitive area of work, I'm still observing, even among companies, a sort of competition on, okay, but my standard is better, my approach is better, my this. So I think that as soon as we can really break these barriers of collaboration and just focus on what needs to be done, what the more important things are on the ground, and then simply join resources, join effort, create enabling laws at different levels, I think things can be, I want to say easily not, but can be set in the right direction and really bring some important impacts.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions for today. Our many thanks again to Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Willcutts, and Mr. Biraghi for joining us today, and to our members for their participation. If you have further questions, please have your staff contact Taylor Reddick on the House Foreign Affairs Committee Majority Staff. The briefing is now concluded, and all attendees may leave the call.